Hello, I'm Roger MacNaughton, and welcome to Notes from a Small Town Son, a collection of memories written by my father, Donald Earl MacNaughton, about his childhood growing up in Lowell, Michigan. Dad was born in 1914, so the dates he wrote about here ranged from about 1918 until 1929. Our mother, Marguerite, known as Maggie, passed away in 1984 after Dad had retired from his career in printing. My sister Kay mentioned to Dad that, to keep busy, he might try his hand at writing about his early years. So it was in 1985 that he began to put down on paper these memories that you are about to hear, and he continued to write sparingly until 1990. I only wish Dad had written more. So let's begin. Dad's words. January 25th, 1985. The old grouch is once again sitting at the table, looking out at all that beautiful white stuff covering everything that's already been covered since day one. Anybody in his right mind would be in Florida or Bermuda or Tahiti or any place where the natives want to know what snow looks like. Anyone who would want to know what snow looks like should likewise have his head examined. Of course, I can remember many times as a kid, I would play for hours in the dang stuff, get cold and wet and slide some more. I remember my brother and I each had a champion sled, the common Model T variety that almost all the kids used for transportation. Of course, there were half a dozen around town who had rich parents. These boys sported the real thing, the Cadillac of sleds, a flexible flyer. If you were lucky and gave of your candy bar, you just might get one slide on a flexible flyer. Wow! You see, a flexible flyer was really so much more flexible than a champion. You could steer it so much more because the runners would bend further. You could buy a champion for about $4 or $5, but the Cadillac variety would set you back as much as $10 or $12, depending on the length of the sled. I never was much good on ice skates. I was a scrawny kid with weak ankles, and even if I could keep the clamp-on skates fastened to my high-top shoes, it was about the limit of my ability just to stand up on them. I had about the same limited success when it came to skiing. The set of old barrel staves that were my skis had the same ability to go backward as they did forward, with the result that I spent a lot of time traveling in one spot. There is a river in the town where I grew up called Flat River. I have never learned why it was called Flat River. Every river I've ever seen was just as flat. Anyway, it divided the town into the east side and the west side. The school I attended after 4th grade was on the east side, and I lived on the west side. As with all rivers, flat or otherwise, this one froze over during the winter. On this flat river was a dam downstream a little way, so between my school and home was a sort of pond. It was much closer for the west side kids to walk home over the ice rather than around by the bridge. Every year, the same 2 or 3 kids would get wet testing the ice in the early winter. This walking the ice, like so many things in life, was not all gravy. The people who owned the dam had the annoying habit of opening and closing the gates from time to time. The result was the water in the pond would rise and lower and break up the ice near the shores. When this happened, areas along the shoreline would be covered with a couple inches of awful, cold, wet water. The really tough cookies would slosh through it onto solid ice, while the rest of us chickens used the bridge until the water froze solid enough to walk on. Back a ways, I mentioned high-top shoes. It was considered in if you had these contraptions made out of stiff leather and laced up almost to your knees. They were supposed to keep your feet and legs warm and dry as long as you kept the shoes well oiled. Neat's foot oil was what you used, applied with a rag and rubbed it into the leather. You did your homework early because the rest of the evening you rubbed and rubbed and rubbed. The moment I started to dislike the white stuff was when I got my first set of wheels, real grown-up wheels, like a well-used 1929 Chevrolet Coupe. Wheels and snow just do not mix, as I soon learned. The result was one blown tire and a badly bent rear axle when I slid off the road trying to turn a corner. From then on, me and that lousy snow have definitely been on the outs. The heck of it is, I'm on the losing side. The blamed stuff just keeps on coming, and I sit and keep on cussing. Can't win. Monday, February 4th, 1985. Yep, here I sit again, still looking at that awful white stuff and shivering every time I look at the thermometer. It's about 14 degrees out there. Believe me, I'm getting itchy feet. They say when you get some years on your creaky old bones, you remember your youth well, but at times can't remember where the bedroom is at bedtime. I grew up during my early years without a father. Mother was a widow. So I didn't know what a slingshot was until one day in the summer I watched some men cutting down some trees near the Catholic church just a block up the street from our house. Soon there were boys from all over town swarming over the branches of those fallen trees. It was some time later that I learned they were cutting crotches. What the heck is a crotch? It's a small piece of wood about 8 or 9 inches long that's grown in the shape of a Y. You attach strips of rubber to the top prongs and use the stem of the Y as a handle. A small stone was held in the rubber strips and pulled back as far as possible. When you let go of the stone, it would take off like a bullet and fly a country mile. The rubber strips were cut about 1/2 inch wide and 10 or 12 inches long from an old leaky inner tube. All car and truck tires in those days had an inner tube that held the air. Well, it was not very long before every old inner tube promptly disappeared from all 3 garages and gas stations in town. The best slingshots were made from truck tubes because they were heavier and packed more power. My slingshots were made from grade B notches and rubbers cut from bicycle tubes. I was well back from the front runners in this sport. Oh yeah, in order to be correct, each rubber was attached to a small piece of soft leather in which you placed your projectile. Now the very best leather was available in the tongue of your shoes. Many a mother in those days flung her arms up in despair to find that one or both of Sonny Boy's shoes was minus a tongue. Boy, them were the days. February 11th, 1985. Yep, same old grouch, griping about the same awful stuff outdoors. Should just pack up and head south, but they're getting it down there too. Just to show how far back I can remember, a day when my mother took me downtown and a lot of people were hooting and hollering, and a train was on the trestle across the river, and blowing its whistle like crazy. My mother said, "The war is over and everybody is happy." World War I, that is. I was 4 years old. I can also remember how I celebrated the end of World War II, but I'm not going to get into that. I can still remember the hangover. When my brother and I were growing up, we lived on the west side of town, on the corner of Main Street and Vergennes Avenue, later renamed Lincoln Lake Avenue. Being a corner lot with a large backyard, it soon became the neighborhood baseball diamond for all the kids in the area. Never had to worry too much about mowing the grass. Since in those days none of the roads were paved, cars were always kicking up lots of dust and causing much anguish among mothers and grandmothers trying to keep the house clean. It was a ritual every evening during the summer after supper to get out the hose and sprinkle the road to lay the dust. This would be effective for about a half an hour, when the road would dry again. This was definitely not a chore to be left to the small fry to handle. There was just way too much temptation. You can imagine what could happen when a car drove by with no side curtains or the windows rolled down. There developed for several years a much more effective dust layer program in our area. Across the street was a family who owned and operated several gas stations. The owner could collect old crankcase oil in 55-gallon drums and at intervals would load these in his truck and bring it around. All the men in the neighborhood would show up with old pails that had been punched full of holes. They did a great job of oiling the road, and that would lay the dust for a long time. I imagine that after the job was done, the boys slopped up more than one glass of home brew, because they all seemed to disappear at once. We never knew where. February 14th, 1985. There was one pastime I did manage to master rather well. It was the art of rolling a hoop. Maybe you have seen pictures of small boys dressed up fit to kill, rolling a great big hoop with an itty-bitty little stick to guide it. Now that ain't the way we did it. First of all, you had to find a hoop. Anywhere from 5 to 10 inches in diameter would do. If you didn't have a hoop, a wheel off an old baby buggy or busted-up coaster wagon would work okay. When equipped with this necessary piece of equipment, the rest was easy. All you needed was a flat, narrow stick about 3 feet long. Another piece of stick about 8 or 9 inches long was nailed across the end of the long one, making a long, skinny letter T. To start the hoop rolling, you held one end of the stick in your hand with a guiding end on the sidewalk and rolled the hoop down the stick. By gently pushing the hoop with the crossbar, you could control the speed. To steer it, you tipped the crossbar one way or the other. Us neighborhood kids used to see who could make the hoop go the slowest without tipping it over. You were pretty darn good if you could roll it down the porch steps without tipping it over. We spent many, many hours rolling our hoops all over town. For a diversion, once in a while we would locate some large pet milk cans. They're still around today, the kind you punch a hole in the end to drain the can. If you laid the can, empty of course, on the sidewalk and stomped really hard, just right, the can would flatten in the middle and the ends would clamp around your shoes and stick there. The resulting noise, trotting up and down the sidewalk, we used to think was like horses stamping along the brick pavement downtown. When the whole pack of us were in full cry, the people on the west side of town were soon quite upset with the racket. Dad must have taken a little bit of a break from his writings, like about 3 years or so, because the next post comes from June 5th, 1988. Here I sit. The temperature out there is about 92 or 93 degrees and higher in here. I remember when we were kids and the ice wagon. When I was just a young puppy, we used to keep our milk, butter, and eggs and stuff in the fruit cellar. The fruit cellar was a small room somewhere under the house, usually with just a dirt floor. Below ground and dark, it was cool and would keep potatoes and fruit for a long time. Meat was bought and cooked shortly after delivery from the meat market. And then came a radical change: the ice box and the ice wagon. The ice box was about the same size as our modern refrigerators. It was built of wood and well insulated, and the top opened up so a 50-pound chunk of ice could be inserted. Below was the main door for the food storage section. As the ice melted, it cooled the whole thing down quite nicely. At the very bottom was a door behind which a pan was kept to catch the meltwater. You got your backside blistered if you forgot to dump the pan every day. Since more ice had to be added every 2 or 3 days, there had to be an ice truck and an iceman to make deliveries. We had 2 in our town. One was a big, jolly guy who saw to it that there was always a plentiful supply of small pieces of ice lying on the bed of his truck to cool off the hard-playing small fry of the neighborhood. Boy, did that ice taste good on a hot summer day. If someone wanted only 25 pounds of ice and his chunks were 50 pounds, he would wield his trusty ice pick, and presto, that 50-pound cake would be 2 25-pound pieces, minus a few small bits that just fit our thirsty mouths. The other delivery man we steered clear of, because he would not give us any ice at all. In fact, he would chase us away from his truck. We didn't like him one little bit. I wonder if he ever had nightmares of desperate little kids suffering horribly because they were dying of thirst for a small piece of ice which just lay there in his truck and slowly melted onto the ground. I wonder if he ever figured out a way to deduct the value of those pieces he couldn't sell from his income tax. I bet he did, the old skinflint. Up the street from us lived a chubby kid whom my brother and I became good friends with. His mother was a widow and owned and operated a variety store on Main Street. As I have mentioned earlier, our town had a river flowing right through the middle of it. Many of the stores on Main Street were built out over the water in back of them. Now this variety store had a narrow back porch running the full width of the store. At one end of the porch was built what is known as an outhouse, and this was a 2-holer, ideal for small boys to drop a fish line through each of the holes. We spent many enjoyable hours dangling hook and worm down below. Occasionally, we would catch a small bluegill, but we were not allowed to keep it. It took me quite a while to figure out why. Of course, there were times when we were forced to suspend our angling for a few minutes. Because. I'm sure glad I never had to use that outhouse on a blizzardly cold day in the middle of winter. Oh yes, something else I remember. Early one summer when we were growing up, our mother bought a nice, comfortable, colorful hammock to hang between the corner of our house and a big old pine tree just the right distance away. Her intentions were the best, but things just didn't work out that way. In the first place, there was always an argument between my brother and myself over who spent the most time in it. In the second place, it developed that no matter who occupied the hammock, it was only a matter of a minute or so before one of the ever-present kids nearby would dump the occupant out on the ground. It wasn't long before said article began to show considerable wear and tear. However, the hammock was suddenly retired one day when one of the small fry sneaked up and dumped my Uncle Louis, who was visiting us at the time. Goodbye, hammock. Just a few steps from our back porch was a small building about the size of a small one-car garage, which we called the woodshed, because that's what it was. In the front part was also the coal bin. It also was a catch-all for all sorts of odds and ends. I was quite young when I thought it was fun to play in there with matches, until one evening when I set a fire in there I couldn't put out. Very fortunately for me, a neighbor saw the conflagration and grabbed our garden hose and doused the flames with no damage to the shed. Boy, was I scared. I didn't use matches after that until I started smoking cigarettes many years later. Another memory. In our town, we had several grocery stores and some meat markets. Also, a couple of dry goods stores and drugstores, and a delivery wagon. This delivery wagon was a sort of homemade contraption that was covered with canvas. It had a door on each side and a small peephole in front, above two small slits for the harness reins to pass through to guide the horse that pulled it. The townfolk would call in their orders on the telephone to the grocery or meat market of their choice, and the delivery man would make the rounds of all the stores and pick up the various packages. If we caught him in a cheerful mood, he would sometimes let one or two of us kids ride with him for a block or two. Boy, what a thrill. Sometimes the phone orders would be too late for the morning delivery, so the plans for the day would have to be altered because the stuff would be delivered on the afternoon run. It was not uncommon for one of the merchants to send a clerk up the street for a spool of thread from the dry goods stores to be included in the order. Back in my ancient youth, just as soon as the snow melted in early spring, it was marble time at the old West Ward School. Now, the way we played marbles was not the same as the real kneel around in a ring variety. No, sir, we did it different. Every boy carried either a cigar box or a cloth bag with a drawstring. We carried a supply of pretty glass ones of various sizes and sometimes 2 or 3 shiny steel balls. The glass marbles were called glassies, and the steel balls were steelies. We also carried a number of plain old clay ones we called megs. Before school, at recess, lunchtime, and after school, we shot marbles. If a young buck was a little short of megs, he would offer up a pretty glassy or steely. He would set his prize in the dirt and draw a line some distance away and allow the kids to stand at the line and toss a meg at it. He would get to keep the megs that missed. This would continue until someone hit the glassy, whereupon he would claim his prize. If one of the boys got low on megs, he would build up his supply by this method. The active players usually had a large supply of megs or a collection of pretty glassies and a small amount of megs. Another way to play was to carry a cigar box with a small hole in the top. A particular glassy was offered as prizes, and the player would stand over the box and try to drop a meg through the hole. Well, anyway, we had a lot of hours of fun playing marbles. During these springtime days before school vacation, while we were trading in marbles, the girls in the old school were congregating on the steps, either playing jacks or talking about us mucking about in the mud. Here I must describe the West Ward School. It was old. It was square and built of brick. It had a half basement and was 2 stories tall, with real high ceilings on each floor. The entrance was reached by 4 or 5 cement steps that led to a wide cement porch at the front doors. Flanked on each side was a wide rail of cement, all of which made an ideal spot for the girls to hang out. At the very top of the school was a wide overhang on all sides. For some reason I never understood, this arrangement was to the liking of a large number of pigeons. Now, as you know, a pigeon is not at all fussy about where he goes to the bathroom. Consequently, it was not uncommon to suddenly hear an unearthly shriek from one of the little ladies as she made a mad dash into the bathroom where the teacher would clean her up. We kids thought it was very funny. Periodically, the teacher would declare all-out war on those pigeons. Now, the same kids who owned flexible flyer sleds also possessed real Daisy air rifles. Those lucky devils were invited by the teacher to bring them to school and depopulate those pesky eave dwellers during recess. Since the teacher was also present, our recesses tended to last twice as long as usual, much to our delight. Soon, during the shooting, all the enemy disappeared around to the other side of the school building. Anyway, once in a while, one of the critters was actually brought to earth, where it was promptly dispatched to bird heaven. Much later. I wasn't very old when I first heard the word radio. That was a wondrous thing, which allowed a person to hear someone talking over in the next state or two without listening on the telephone. My older cousin had one that was called a crystal set. It was hooked up to a battery, and it had some kind of crystal and a stiff wire you used to touch the crystal. If you touched it at the right spot, you could hear someone talking. My cousin let me put on his earphones one time so I could hear it. Boy, what a thrill! The big grown-up folks had a much better radio, however. Those were much larger and had 3 big round dials on them. The dials had numbers around their edges, and by turning the dials, you could get several different stations at different dial settings. These big radios used a mess of electronic vacuum tubes instead of a crystal, and were much more powerful. Each radio had to be connected to an outdoor aerial or antenna. The higher and longer the aerial, the better the results. As time went by and us kids got a little older, we had to have our own radios, like a small one-tube job. These were available, usually used for about $3 or $4. For a few cents, we could buy some used aerial wire and some insulators and proceed to string an aerial, usually from a nearby tree, to the upstairs window of our houses. Of course, we would have to wait some time to earn enough money to buy a set of used headphones. Once we had them, all hell would break loose. You see, those old one-lungers had a terrible tendency to squeal as you tuned them, in the grown-up radios, that is. More than 1 or 2 of us were the recipients of telephone calls from our irate neighbors who were trying to listen to some fine music. Of course, it was always some other kid's radio that was causing the awful noise. Boy, them were the days. After them came girls, and then there were some changes, and how. January 18, 1989. What was life like back when I was growing up? Well, first of all, my family and relatives were not rich. Neither were they paupers. We had plenty to eat and decent clothes on our back. Our everyday clothes were kept clean and showed the effects of many washings. Then, of course, we had our Sunday clothes. No horsing around in those, mister. They were removed and carefully put away immediately after Sunday school. Our house was a wood frame structure, and in the winter months it was heated by a coal stove set up in one room of the house. Cooking was done on a big black monster kitchen range. This stove burned either wood or coal, but mostly wood. The firebox was at one end. In the center was an oven, and at the other end was a water tank called a reservoir. These three sections were all underneath the cooking top, which made the top quite large and roomy. If food needed to be cooked from scratch, it was set right on top of the firebox. Afterwards, other dishes were moved over the oven part, which would keep everything hot until served. If a pie or cake or two were to be baked, the fire was stoked up just right to heat the oven to the correct temperature. In our house, we had a large kitchen, and near the range was a wood box. This held the day's supply of fuel. It was my job every morning before school to fill up the wood box from the supply in the woodshed. Of course, about every other day, the ashes had to be removed and dumped on the ash pile way out in the backyard. This was in addition to bringing in buckets of coal for the front room heater and, of course, cleaning out and dumping its ashes. This chore was usually done right after supper, after which was school homework. Oh yeah, we had plenty in those days, too. In our house, the heating stove was installed in the sitting room. The parlor was where the best furnishings were and was kept for entertaining visiting company. During the winter, our family lived mostly in the sitting room and the kitchen. The rest of the house got more than a mite chilly, especially the bedrooms. You didn't fall asleep right away because you were too busy shivering for the first half hour. Happy was the day when the coal stove was taken down and stowed in the woodshed. That meant spring had arrived. And of course the opposite was true when the time came to put up the stove come fall. January 1990. In looking back at this nonsense, I see the date 1985. That is 5 years ago. I was sitting in the same spot. Boy, have I gotten lazy. Because I write only when the mood strikes, the mood has not hit me for some time, it seems. When I was a kid of about 11 or 12, my grandmother had a brother who lived on a farm about 50 miles east of Lowell. A few times she took me with her to visit him. We went by train, and that was an exciting trip, all 50 miles of it. My great-uncle Jim had a son, Ed, who lived nearby but worked the farm. Ed had a son who was about a year older than I. On one of our trips to visit, it was time to harvest the wheat crop. Very interesting and exciting. Wheat was not combined as it is today, but was thrashed by a thrashing crew. This thrashing crew was composed of 2 or 3 men, and they used a separator and a steam engine to supply the power. Those 2 machines were big, believe me. The separator was a huge, ugly, but interesting machine with a mess of wheels and belts showing all over it. The most impressive machine was the steam engine. It was also big. It was not a thing of beauty. Small front wheels and huge rear wheels as tall as a man. It had a steam whistle you could hear in the next county. When the harvest was finished, this crew would hook the separator to the engine and pull it to the next farm on their list. The speed on the trip was rather slow, about as fast as a man could walk. The wheels were simply wide, flat steel, and riding was tough. This harvest crew came to the farm the day before and set the separator near the barn and aimed a large steel pipe about 8 inches in diameter out over a patch of ground near the barn. The engine was put in place about 50 feet away, and a long, flat leather belt was installed between the large flywheel on the engine and the separator. Early the next morning, a fire was started in the engine and steam pressure was built up. During this time, a number of farmer neighbors arrived with their horse-drawn wagons and began loading shocks of wheat from the field. Loaded wheat would be brought to the separator and tossed into it. This machine would separate the wheat kernels from the plant and spill them into burlap bags on a wagon. The rest of the plant was blown out of the pipe to make a huge straw stack on the ground. To carry out this harvest of wheat required a fairly large number of people, and these people were neighboring farmers who all joined to help. As Ed's boy and myself were a little young to pitch wheat or drive a team, we nevertheless were expected to earn our dinner. Our job was in the granary where the wheat was dumped in a large bin. We were supposed to level off the pile and see to it that all corners of the bin were filled evenly. And then came dinner, and boy, what a dinner! A dinner for thrashers was an awesome array of good old farm victuals. We ate at the second serving until we were stuffed, completed with pie and ice cream. This meal was prepared and served by the wives of the farmer helpers. As you can see, all this I remember from a long time ago, so it was a pretty impressive moment in my life. Note: when I wrote the previous papers, I had 2 purposes in mind only. One of the purposes was simply for something to do to occupy my time. Since I am retired, I have a lot of it at hand. What follows may not be proper King's English, but since my education consisted of the usual public school and a smattering of first-year college, I am simply trying to do the best I can. The second purpose for the ramblings, that sometime in the future my grandchildren, or maybe their children or grandchildren, might get a small kick out of what things were like back in the days when dinosaurs were not so extinct. That is, of course, provided this stuff has not been tossed in the wastebasket beforehand. Well, anyway, I have had the fun of writing it. Since I was born in 1914, the time period involved in the ramblings would be from the end of World War I in 1918 to about 1929, give or take a year or so. Those years were good ones, and I enjoyed them, and I certainly do not look back at them with any regrets. Roger here. So that's it. The end of Dad's writings. As I said earlier, I and my sisters, Kathy and Kay, wish he had written much more. He was just beginning to develop his style, an everyman, spinning tales in a modest and slightly humorous fashion. My sense is that he was mostly an introvert, taking the position that who would want to read these silly things anyway? In later years, Dad loved to portray himself as the old grouch, even signing that on cards and letters. But even though he had lots of opinions, we rarely saw or heard him acting in a grouchy manner. He loved a good joke. When I would tell him the latest one I'd heard, he'd invariably shake his head amidst spasms of laughter and say, "Is that what they're teaching you in college?" Dad worked for many years as the head printer at the Lowell Ledger, and later at Gus Unsel's Sons in Grand Rapids as a linotype operator. He earned his 15 minutes of fame in December of 1944 when he left the letter R out of the word shirts in an advertisement for Kuhn's clothing store. That issue of the Ledger sold out completely. I'm sure Dad took on his fair share of ribbing over that one, but he handled it, even insinuating to us in later years that the font had been huge. When Kay, Kathy, and I went back into the archives, we were a tiny bit disappointed to find out that the font was actually quite small. Dad surely earned a lifetime of fame with us. We miss you, Dad. You done good.